Continue the conversation. Joining me now here in Washington is Mark Harold. He is a former officer with the Atlanta Police Department. He's now an attorney and a political analyst. And from California is John Powell. He's professor at law at the University of California, Berkeley. Also with us here in the studio is Atiba Majun. He is an executive with 20 years of experience building coalitions between corporations and government bodies. Welcome to the show, all three of you. Mark, let's start with you. Sure. You're the former police officer. Let's lay it out. Is there racism in the police force that leads to these deaths?
I was in the city of Atlanta Police Department, and racial politics in the city of Atlanta is paramount. It's a large part of the city politics, the cultural politics of the city. Do I think that there's this rampant number of, or that it's the norm that cops are racist? No, I don't. I think that a lot of it has to do with the law enforcement tactics in lower socioeconomic communities, the types of laws that are applied in a disparate way against lower socioeconomic areas, which is a lot of times crack cocaine, certain types of drugs. The drug war has a huge part of it, but I think the biggest change has to do with when the subjective intent of the officer becomes irrelevant, and you only have to show as a police officer after the fact objective reasonableness. And what you were thinking isn't important, it's just what you did and how it affected a citizen. I think that really opens up the doors for a lot of impermissible use of race as a factor in the stop, but you don't ever really have to say that.
We'll get onto the law in a bit. John Powell, I'd like to go out to you in California. Racism endemic in America's police forces, ending with the death of lots of different black men across this country. Agree or disagree?
Well, part of the issue is what do we mean by racism? If we mean people walking around with intentional, hostile, negative attitudes toward groups of people, research suggests that that's going down, not evenly. Sometimes it goes down and comes back up. But in terms of implicit bias, racial hostility held at the unconscious level, which we can measure. So we can't ask someone if you're biased in an unconscious way because you don't know. It's actually endemic in America, not just in the police department, but endemic. And part of the problem is that America has a hard time facing up to that because we so much want to be beyond race, even when all the evidence indicate in terms of our behavior and consequences, race is critically important, we actually want to deny it.
Atiba, unconscious bias. I read somewhere that a black man is more likely to be shot by a police officer for carrying a wallet than a white man with a gun. Do you feel that way?
I saw that. You know, as a black man growing up in the United States, there have been plenty of instances, you know, I can go back to being pulled over by police officers, and I think that there's probably a different type of, I don't know if it's fear or consciousness about what's the possibility that could happen in those type of stops. I recall at maybe 17, 18 years old being pulled over by police officers and pulled from the car, and the car was searched for no reason. I think my friend who was driving that night had made a U-turn, whether or not it was illegal or not. But the stop and the questions and the way that we were pressed that evening, being a young person impressed by police officers, it was very uncomfortable. And I think that that is something that you can ask a lot of black males in this country, their own experiences with police officers. They will tell you a similar story.
Mark, is this true? Because you talked about socioeconomic groupings, and we know in the United States it's much more likely for young black men to go to jail, young black men to deal drugs, for example. So does this become a sort of endemic racism where cops who may not be from that community, and this is another point I'd like you to address, suddenly feel that there's suspicion before there's any proof?
Well, I mean, I think that officers basically do, the way that they're trained, you do work with suspicion before proof. I think that's a given. You work basically from the types of exception of the Fourth Amendment. You deal with reasonable suspicion, and it moves towards probable cause and possibly towards a physical arrest. But I do believe that's true. I mean, when I police, now one thing about it is, as far as the permissibility of race in individualized suspicion determinations, the area that I worked in Atlanta, the Fourth Ward area, was almost 100% African American. At the time I was there in the 90s.
What was the proportion of African Americans on your police force in that area?
Yeah. It was honestly, it was pretty high, but I'm really not sure. I can't say. I mean, it was the city of Atlanta. It was not 100%, of course. It was not 100%, of course. But there's definitely a perception issue there. And anytime everyone has had different experiences with law enforcement that sometimes can't be understood by different folks. That obviously is a different experience than I had. I'll be the first to admit that. When I'm pulled over by a police officer, my first reaction isn't fear. I might be a little annoyed or wonder what I did and want to get out of there. But I pretty much assume I'm going to be treated fairly, and I don't think that's the case for everybody.
There seems to be a big sort of public reaction over the last few months, nearly a year now, from Ferguson to South Carolina. John Powell, why are people taking to the streets across America now, considering we had statistics from John Gilmore's report there that suggested this has been going on for a long time?
Well, you know, Nate, before I answer that, I want to go back to something you suggested, that part of the explanation, and we'd actually look for something to explain racial differences, is like anything but race. Could it be socioeconomic?
Right.
Could it be culture? Could it be that it was late at night? Could it be unknown? Actually, it's not that complicated. Right. The reality is blacks do not engage in drug use any more than whites. In fact, it's actually slightly lower. That is, and I've done studies on this. 10 years ago, we were talking about racial profiling. And again, looking at the data in terms of racial profiling that fell off the map largely because of 9/11, racial profiling was not explained in terms of criminal behavior. If you look at the stops in New York in terms of what's called hits and stops, it was not justified in terms of black behavior. So too often when we see this, we want to justify in terms of, well, there's something going on in the black community, there's something going on in black culture. None of that explains this, what's going on. And again, we don't ask people, we measure it. We have empirical evidence showing that America, writ large, not just police, we are endemic with implicit bias against black people.
John, I think that's I think that's an excellent point. And my point was that more black people get jailed, sort of thing,
yes,
not
yes.
that they do it. And can you address though my question that the public backlash against the videos that we've seen, against the cases that we've seen of police officers, largely white, shooting unarmed black men. Why are we seeing this public reaction now?
Well, you know, one of the things we've seen in videos, I mean,
Right.
you know, how old are cell phones? How old are smartphones? You know, 20 years ago, none of us would have had a phone that was also a camera. The whole idea of body cameras. I worked in Minnesota trying to get cameras in the car. That was a radical thing, and it was expensive, and it was complicated, and it was technologically complicated. Today it's simple. Almost everyone has a cell phone. So one thing is that it's visibly being seen. If we think about going back to the 60s, when police were being sicked on dogs and police were being sicked on marchers in the civil rights movement, it wasn't until it was televised that there was a reaction. So the event itself doesn't trigger the reaction. It's like people being aware of it, and one of the best ways to be aware of it is through television and videos.
John, I think you're absolutely hitting a really important point here, is that it used to take a journalist to turn up with a camera. Now it takes a citizen with a cell phone. Atiba, do you think that has changed? We look at the case of Eric Garner in New York, for example, the choking video, Walter Scott with the shooting in the back. Is that what is motivating the public opinion, or was it always bubbling under the surface and people wanted to see evidence that was more prevalent than just their community?
I've been hearing, you know, this has been going on for over 30 years. I mean, there have been plenty of instances where, right here in D.C. in PG County, you know, I recall when I was a child, hearing stories of police brutality against black men. This has been going on for a very long time. The outrage that we are seeing now and that we're hearing now is social media has changed a lot. Our reporters are now citizens, you know, who are right there on the scene, who are able to be cameramen, who are able to provide this video to media outlets who can spread this. And also just with social media in itself, we're sharing it among ourselves and we're having these conversations, and a lot of us are upset. So when this conversation becomes about race, it's because there have been a number of black people who have been calling this out for a long time, but there hasn't been evidence as we have now in the cases in New York, in the cases that we're seeing now where we can actually see that the police officers have been a bit more aggressive. And it brings the question, what are the rules of engagement in terms of what police officers can and cannot do in terms of these stops? Because police officers are warranted and have every right to go and work and want to go home and to their families. But so do the citizens whom they're supposed to be protecting.
I think you raised a really interesting point. Walter Scott, for example, who was shot in the back in South Carolina, the policeman's report was very different from the video that we got, and it was only when the video came out that we saw the department go into action. I want to ask you then, Mark, is video from citizens the sort of new DNA that we will have at these trials, at these prosecutions, that is the sort of the smoking gun, if you like, going forward?
Yeah, I think in many cases it will be. I don't think that in some cases the officers would have been charged criminally either as quickly as they were without the video. Obviously, the The credibility of the police officer is going to be called highly into question if the video surfaces after the report. And of course, when there's other types of video, surveillance video, the police can quickly go. If there's surveillance video from an ATM, as soon as it's robbed, as soon as the bank's robbed, the police can quickly go and get it. Citizen video is different. It might come to the surface a week later, a month later, a year later, even after a trial. It may surface because there's no obligation technically to turn it over. So it's definitely an interesting dynamic for police departments because at the time the officer prepares the report, and this isn't a bad thing, he doesn't know what's out there. He doesn't know what check and balance is out there. In the old days, he was pretty sure that a video of everything was not going to come up a week or two after he wrote the report.
Well, I'm glad you said that he was sure that a video wasn't going to come up. So in the Walter Scott case, this officer who obviously knew what had happened because he was shot in the back, wrote a completely, it looks like, erroneous report, but was only found out because of the video. John Powell, does this suggest that police are just used to doing this?
Well, you know, it's hard to actually, I mean, first of all, we're talking about an incident. It's an incident that's endemic. We have to be a little bit careful. We got videos in Minnesota. We had the police department support us. And one of the things we argued is that most police don't engage in brutality, and we don't know. It's better to know. It's better for the police are doing their job properly, and it's better for the public, for the police are not doing their jobs. So we don't want to exaggerate. There's obviously a problem. 1,000 people being killed is a problem. Many of them being black, many of them is a problem. But most stops don't result in killing. Most contact with the police don't. It does erode the public trust. Now, the technology is changing. In a few years, we're going to probably see something different. So it's not just citizen videos. We have more surveillance on the streets. The technology is changing. We have body cameras. We have car cameras. So yeah, I think having a visual image of what happens is a good thing. We have to be careful because even that can be problematic on some levels in terms of privacy and other things. But this is actually prophylactic because actually we don't want just to know what happened. We want to stop it from happening. We actually want to create an environment where there's good policing, there's a good relationship between the police and the community, or racial bias is not playing a big part. So we actually want to go upstream and not just figure out what happens after someone has been shot or killed.
John,